Michael had always worked hard to provide for his son Daniel. A single father in a small, quiet town, Michael was determined to give his son a good life, filled with love, learning, and opportunity. Daniel, a bright 8-year-old with a smile that could light up any room, was the center of his world. The two had a strong bond, and Michael made sure to spend as much time with his son as possible, despite the pressures of work. They lived in a modest house on a peaceful street, where neighbors often stopped by to chat, and children played outside until the sun went down. It was a community where everyone knew each other, and most people were friendly and kind. Michael had always loved the idea of raising his son in a place like this, where he could feel safe and cared for. Daniel, like any child, had his challenges. Though he was healthy overall, there were moments when he felt unwell, and his father would take him to the doctor just to be sure. Michael had always been cautious about Daniel's health and wanted to ensure that nothing was overlooked. One morning, Daniel woke up with a cough and a fever. His father, noticing how pale Daniel looked, quickly decided to take him to the doctor. Michael had heard good things about Dr. Smith, a well-known pediatrician in town. Dr. Smith's clinic was always busy, but Michael had always believed that it was a sign of a trusted doctor. As Michael and Daniel walked into the clinic, they were greeted by a friendly nurse who led them to the waiting area. Daniel clung to his father's side, his little hand wrapped around Michael's finger, and Michael comforted him with a soft smile. The doctor's office was bright and neat, filled with colorful paintings on the walls and toys scattered across the floor. Michael knew this would make Daniel feel at ease. It was clear that the clinic cared about its young patients. When Dr. Smith finally came into the room, Michael could see that he was a man in his late 40s, with short, gray hair and glasses. He seemed professional and confident as he greeted them, though there was something about his expression that Michael couldn't quite place. Still, he assumed it was just nerves. After all, they were in a doctor's office, and Daniel wasn't feeling his best. As the examination began, Daniel grew more comfortable, sitting on the exam table and talking to the doctor about his symptoms. Michael stayed close by, watching every move of the doctor to make sure everything was okay. But as Dr. Smith examined Daniel, his words were strange and distant. He spoke with a coldness that made Michael uneasy, and Daniel, who normally loved chatting with doctors, grew quiet. Dr. Smith said, "Your son seems fine, but he's not one of the types of children I usually treat." His tone wasn't just clinical, it felt dismissive. Michael didn't fully understand what the doctor meant, but he brushed it off as a simple comment. What struck him, however, was the way the doctor's eyes lingered for just a second too long on Daniel's skin color. As they left the clinic, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, but he hoped it was just his imagination. Little did he know, the journey ahead would soon prove that his instincts were right, and that this visit was only the beginning of something much more troubling. This was just the start of a story that would forever change the course of their lives. A few days after their visit to Dr. Smith's clinic, Daniel's condition began to get worse. His cough became more severe, and he complained of feeling dizzy. Michael, worried, decided it was time to take him back to the doctor. He knew something wasn't right, and he wanted to make sure his son received the best care possible. When they arrived at Dr. Smith's office again, the atmosphere felt different. The waiting room was quieter than before, and the nurse at the desk barely looked up as they entered. Michael tried to push aside his growing unease, hoping that the doctor would have an answer to Daniel's worsening symptoms. After a short wait, they were called into the examination room. Dr. Smith entered, looking as composed as ever, but something about his demeanor felt off. Michael couldn't put his finger on it, but the doctor's cold gaze and stiff body language made him feel uncomfortable. Dr. Smith glanced at Daniel, who was sitting quietly on the exam table, his face pale and tired. Without wasting any time, the doctor began his assessment, checking Daniel's temperature and listening to his breathing. Michael held his breath, hoping for some reassuring words. But instead, Dr. Smith sighed and put down his stethoscope. "I don't think this is a priority," he said, his voice detached. "Your son's symptoms don't seem too serious. I don't see the need to continue with any immediate treatment." Michael's heart sank. He could feel the frustration rising inside him. But he didn't want to cause trouble. After all, Dr. Smith was the professional, and Michael had come to trust him. But something about this refusal felt wrong. "Isn't there something we can do?" Michael asked, trying to stay calm. "He's getting worse. I'm really concerned." Dr. Smith didn't seem to notice the worry in Michael's voice. He flipped through some papers on his desk and then looked up at them, his expression still cold. "Like I said," he replied, "it's just a minor cold. Nothing to worry about." Michael couldn't believe his ears. How could the doctor dismiss his concerns so easily? He had seen his son suffer, and now the doctor was telling him there was nothing to worry about. A feeling of helplessness swept over him. He wanted to argue, to demand more attention for Daniel, but he didn't want to make things worse. Instead, he nodded slowly, feeling as though his trust in Dr. Smith was being shaken. As they left the office, Daniel's condition continued to deteriorate. Michael spent the entire evening trying to comfort his son, but his worry only grew. The doctor had refused treatment, and now Daniel's health seemed to be slipping away before his eyes. The next morning, Michael knew he couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't just sit by while his son's health worsened. Something needed to be done. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. It was clear to him now. Dr. Smith wasn't the right doctor for Daniel. Michael knew he had to find another way to help his son. But little did he know, this would be the first of many difficult decisions he would have to make in the days to come. Michael couldn't just walk away quietly. This situation was far from over. It was only the beginning of a fight that would change their lives forever. After his visit to Dr. Smith, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. His son Daniel was still not feeling well, and Dr. Smith's refusal to offer treatment left Michael feeling helpless. He had trusted the doctor, but now he felt like he had been dismissed, as if Daniel's health didn't matter. That night, as Daniel slept restlessly, Michael spent hours searching online for other doctors. He knew he couldn't wait any longer. Daniel needed help, and Michael was determined to find a doctor who would take his son's symptoms seriously. The next morning, Michael called several medical offices in the area, explaining Daniel's condition. After a few calls, he found Dr. Patel, a pediatrician who had recently moved to the town. Dr. Patel was well reviewed and had a reputation for being kind and thorough. Michael made an appointment for the very next day, praying that this doctor would be different. When they arrived at Dr. Patel's clinic, Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him. The waiting room was bright and welcoming, with colorful posters on the walls and toys scattered around for children to play with. The staff seemed warm and friendly, and it gave Michael a sense of comfort. This was different from the cold atmosphere at Dr. Smith's office. Daniel, still feeling sick, sat quietly beside his father. Michael could see the concern in his son's eyes as they waited for their turn. He gently rubbed Daniel's back, hoping to ease his worry. Finally, they were called into the examination room. Dr. Patel, a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a gentle smile, greeted them warmly. She immediately put Daniel at ease by speaking to him softly, asking him about how he was feeling and what symptoms he had been experiencing. Daniel, who had been shy and nervous with Dr. Smith, opened up right away. Michael was relieved to see his son feeling more comfortable. Dr. Patel carefully examined Daniel, listening to his chest, checking his temperature, and asking more questions about his symptoms. She didn't rush through the appointment, and Michael could see that she was truly focused on helping Daniel. After a thorough examination, Dr. Patel turned to Michael with a serious but caring expression. "I believe Daniel may have a respiratory infection," she said. "We need to run some tests to be sure, but we can start treatment right away to help him feel better." For the first time in days, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. Dr. Patel's calm and professional approach reassured him that his son was in good hands. She explained the treatment plan clearly and answered all of Michael's questions, making sure he understood every step. As Daniel started his treatment, Michael felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He knew they were on the right path now, but he couldn't forget the way Dr. Smith had treated them. The memory of his coldness and refusal to help haunted him. Michael had made the right choice in seeking a second opinion, but it left him wondering why Dr. Smith had acted the way he did. What had caused the doctor to ignore his concerns and refuse treatment for his son? While Daniel began to improve under Dr. Patel's care, Michael's thoughts were consumed by one question. Why had Dr. Smith behaved so unprofessionally? What had happened that made him treat Daniel's illness as something unimportant? Michael couldn't let go of the feeling that there was more to this story than he could understand. As the days passed, Daniel began to feel better. Under Dr. Patel's care, his health improved quickly, and soon the fever was gone, and his cough was nothing more than a distant memory. Michael felt a sense of relief that he hadn't felt in weeks. His son was healthy again, and that was all that mattered. But while Daniel's recovery was a comfort, Michael's mind couldn't stop racing. He couldn't forget Dr. Smith's refusal to help. He kept thinking about the cold way the doctor had treated them both. Michael knew that something had gone terribly wrong during that appointment, but he couldn't figure out exactly what it was. Dr. Smith's attitude, his dismissive tone, and his refusal to offer any real treatment. It all left a bad taste in Michael's mouth. The more he thought about it, the more angry he became. The town had always felt like a close-knit community. People were friendly, and neighbors looked out for each other. But now, Michael felt like he had been wronged in a place he thought he could trust. It wasn't just about Daniel's health anymore. It was about fairness. It was about doing what was right. Michael knew he couldn't just forget about what had happened. He had to do something. But what could he do? He didn't want to cause trouble or make things harder for anyone, but he also couldn't just ignore the injustice that had taken place. Dr. Smith had acted like Daniel's condition didn't matter, like his son's health wasn't worth his time. The more Michael thought about it, the clearer it became that he needed to take action. But he wasn't sure what that action should be. Should he talk to Dr. Smith directly? Should he report the doctor to the medical board? Michael wasn't sure which direction to take, but he knew that he couldn't let this go without making sure that Dr. Smith's behavior was addressed. One evening, after tucking Daniel into bed, Michael sat down at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. The room was quiet, and he could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. His mind was racing with thoughts and ideas. He thought about calling the clinic, but that didn't feel like enough. He thought about filing a complaint, but he knew it would have to be something more than just words. Michael wanted to make sure that no other parent, no other child, had to experience what he and Daniel had gone through. Michael didn't want to act out of anger, but he also didn't want Dr. Smith to continue practicing medicine without facing the consequences of his actions. He thought about all the children who might be in the same position, whose parents might trust a doctor who wasn't looking out for their best interests. He realized that it wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and making sure that no one else was treated the way they had been. Michael knew that he had to expose the truth, but he also knew that doing so wouldn't be easy. In the quiet of that evening, Michael made a decision. He would gather information. He would make sure that Dr. Smith's actions were known to others, that people understood what had happened. And when the time was right, he would take the next step. The storm had been building for a while, and Michael could feel that it was finally ready to break. The story was far from over. As the days went by, Michael's anger and frustration grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that Dr. Smith's refusal to treat Daniel had been unfair, but it was more than that. It felt wrong. The way the doctor had dismissed Daniel's illness, the way he had shown no care, made Michael feel helpless and betrayed. The thought of other parents trusting Dr. Smith and their children being treated the same way made him feel even more determined. He couldn't let this go. He needed to make sure no one else would face the same treatment. One evening, Michael sat at his kitchen table, the lights dim and the room quiet except for the sound of his breathing. Daniel was asleep, and this was the only time Michael had to think clearly. He knew he couldn't take matters into his own hands in a way that would hurt anyone, but he also knew that something needed to be done. He couldn't just sit back and let Dr. Smith continue practicing without facing the consequences of his actions. Michael had always been a man of action, someone who believed in justice, but he didn't want to act out of anger. He wanted to expose the truth in a way that would be meaningful. So he began to plan. He spent days gathering information about Dr. Smith. He went online, searching for reviews of the doctor, reading what other parents had said about their experiences. Slowly, Michael began to put together a picture of Dr. Smith's behavior. He found several stories from other families who had been treated poorly by the doctor, just as he had. It became clear to Michael that Dr. Smith's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern. But Michael knew that simply sharing the stories of other patients wouldn't be enough. He needed hard evidence. He began to search for any signs of misconduct, any pattern of neglect or mistreatment that could show the doctor's true character. He spent weeks digging deeper, talking to former patients who had once trusted Dr. Smith. Some of them had similar stories. Others had experienced their own versions of what Michael had gone through. Finally, Michael had enough information. He had built a case, but he knew that he couldn't just walk into the medical board and expect them to take action based on his word alone. He needed to make sure his evidence was undeniable. That's when Michael came up with the idea to involve the local news. The media had the power to make Dr. Smith's actions known to the whole town. Michael knew it was a risky move, but he was willing to take the chance. The public needed to know who Dr. Smith truly was, and the pressure of the media might be enough to force the medical board to take action. But Michael wasn't doing this just out of revenge. He was doing it to protect other families from suffering the way he had. He wanted to make sure that no child had to go through the same neglect that Daniel had faced. He wanted to expose the truth so that Dr. Smith couldn't hurt anyone else. With everything in place, Michael felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had made the decision, and now it was time to take action. He wasn't doing this out of anger anymore. He was doing it to bring justice, to stand up for what was right. As he prepared to reveal the truth, Michael knew that he was about to change everything. His plan had been set in motion, and the consequences of Dr. Smith's actions were about to catch up with him. Michael had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, but he believed it was the right thing to do. Armed with the information he had gathered, he was ready to expose Dr. Smith for who he really was. This wasn't just about getting revenge. It was about making sure that no other child or family had to face the same cold, uncaring treatment that he and Daniel had experienced. The first step was reaching out to the local news. Michael had never done anything like this before, but he knew that the power of the media could bring attention to the situation in a way that nothing else could. He called a reporter from the local news station, someone he had heard was fair and trusted by the community. He explained the situation, telling her about his experience with Dr. Smith and about the other families he had spoken to who had suffered similar treatment. The reporter listened carefully to everything Michael said. She asked him questions to get all the details, wanting to understand the full story. Michael told her about the way Dr. Smith had dismissed Daniel's illness, refusing treatment despite the growing concern. He shared how, after seeking a second opinion, Daniel's condition had been diagnosed and treated properly. He also spoke about the families who had shared their own stories of mistreatment. The reporter was moved by Michael's story and agreed to help. She said she would investigate further and air a segment that would bring the truth to light. Michael felt a wave of relief, knowing that he had taken the first step toward exposing Dr. Smith. Over the next few days, the reporter worked hard to gather more information. She interviewed other families who had seen Dr. Smith and were willing to speak out. She spoke to medical professionals who could confirm that Dr. Smith's behavior was far from acceptable. Michael followed up with her regularly, and with each passing day, the story began to take shape. Finally, the day arrived when the news segment was ready to air. Michael could hardly believe it. He had been so focused on the details, so determined to make sure everything was in place, that he hadn't fully realized how big this would be. The news would be reaching hundreds of people in their town and beyond. The truth was about to be shared, and there was no turning back. That evening, Michael sat with Daniel in their living room, watching the news. He could feel his heart beating faster as the reporter began the segment. The camera showed footage of Dr. Smith's clinic, followed by interviews with families who had been treated unfairly. Michael's heart raced as the reporter described the pattern of mistreatment, including his own experience with Daniel. When the camera showed Michael's face, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. He wasn't doing this for fame or attention. He was doing it because he wanted to protect others, to make sure that no child would suffer the way Daniel had. As the segment ended, the reporter explained that the medical board had already begun an investigation into Dr. Smith's practice. The response was immediate. People in the community began to talk, sharing their thoughts and experiences. The news spread quickly, and soon, others who had been mistreated by Dr. Smith came forward. It was clear that Dr. Smith's actions were no longer a secret. Michael sat back, feeling a sense of relief. The storm he had set in motion was only beginning, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he was on the right path. The truth had been exposed, and now it was up to the community and the authorities to take action. Michael knew that no matter what happened next, he had done the right thing. He had stood up for his son and for every child who deserved to be treated with care and respect. You said. The days following the news segment were full of surprises. Michael hadn't fully prepared for the storm of reactions that would follow. As the story spread throughout the community, people were shocked. Many had trusted Dr. Smith with their children's health, and now they were questioning everything. Michael's decision to go public had set off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. The medical board quickly launched an investigation into Dr. Smith's behavior. They reviewed patient complaints and looked into the stories that had been shared. The board took the situation very seriously, and within a week, Dr. Smith's clinic was temporarily closed while the investigation continued. While Michael felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that action was being taken, he also noticed the reactions from those around him. Some people were supportive, praising him for standing up and sharing his story. They admired his courage and agreed that something needed to be done to ensure no other child would suffer in the same way Daniel had. But not everyone saw it that way. There were some who felt that Michael had gone too far. They believed that it was a private matter that should have been dealt with quietly, and that airing the story publicly had ruined Dr. Smith's career. Some even accused Michael of seeking attention. These comments stung, and Michael couldn't help but feel conflicted. He had acted out of love for his son, but now he was faced with a community divided over his actions. Michael spent long hours talking with Daniel, helping him understand why they had done what they did. Daniel, who was only a child, was confused by the attention they were getting. He didn't understand why people were upset or why others were praising his father. Michael explained that sometimes doing the right thing meant standing up even when it wasn't easy. He wanted Daniel to learn that speaking out against unfairness was important, no matter the consequences. As the weeks passed, the investigation into Dr. Smith continued. More families came forward, sharing their experiences. Dr. Smith's history of neglect and dismissive behavior toward minority patients became clear. The medical board found enough evidence to suspend his medical license pending further review. The decision sent a shockwave through the town. Many felt that justice had been served, while others continued to defend the doctor, insisting that he was a victim of false accusations. For Michael, the hardest part of all this was seeing how the story divided the community. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but he knew he had done what was necessary. Daniel's health had improved, but Michael's mind was still focused on the bigger picture. He had taken a stand, and now he had to face the consequences of his decision, both positive and negative. As time went on, Michael began to receive messages from other parents who had faced similar experiences with doctors. They thanked him for his bravery and shared their own stories. Some even asked for advice on how to deal with their situations. Michael realized that by speaking up, he had sparked a much larger conversation about how children and families are treated in healthcare. Despite the challenges and the criticism, Michael felt a sense of pride. He had done what he believed was right. He had protected his son, and in the process, helped others who had been hurt by the same kind of behavior. In the end, Michael understood that standing up for what's right wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. And that lesson would stay with him and Daniel for the rest of their lives. As time went on, life slowly returned to a sense of normalcy for Michael and Daniel. The investigation into Dr. Smith had reached its conclusion, and the doctor's license was officially revoked. The community, though still divided on the issue, began to move forward. Dr. Smith's clinic was permanently closed, and no longer would any other child face the neglect Daniel had experienced. For Michael, this was a bittersweet victory. He was relieved that justice had been served, but he knew the road to get there had not been easy. For weeks, Michael had been bombarded with messages and opinions from the community. Some supported him wholeheartedly, while others still believed he had gone too far. But over time, those voices began to fade, and what remained were the lessons he had learned along the way. Michael had always been a quiet man, content with his life as a single father, working hard to provide for his son. But the events of the past few months had changed him. They had shown him that sometimes standing up for what's right requires more than just speaking out. It takes courage, persistence, and the willingness to face difficult consequences. Michael had never intended for his actions to spark such a big conversation, but now he realized that his decision had brought awareness to an important issue: how children are treated in healthcare, and how prejudices can sometimes go unnoticed. Through it all, Michael's relationship with Daniel had grown stronger. They had faced a difficult challenge together, and it had bonded them in a way that was unbreakable. Michael was proud of the way Daniel had handled everything. Despite the attention and confusion, Daniel never once complained or felt scared. He had always trusted his father, and he understood that the reason they had gone through all of this was because Michael loved him and wanted to protect him. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Michael realized that the most important thing he had done wasn't exposing Dr. Smith. It was teaching his son to stand up for what is right. Daniel had witnessed firsthand that when you see something wrong, you don't stay silent. You speak up, even when it's hard. "Dad," Daniel said softly, breaking the silence, "do you think everything will be okay now?" Michael smiled and pulled him closer. "I think it will be, buddy. We've done what we needed to do. We stood up for you, and for others who might need help, and that's something I'm really proud of." Daniel looked up at him, his eyes wide. "I want to help people too, Dad. Like you did." Michael's heart swelled with pride. His son was learning the lessons that he would carry for the rest of his life. The values of kindness, respect, and standing up for others were things Michael had always hoped to teach him, but now he knew they were lessons Daniel would never forget. In the end, the greatest reward wasn't the downfall of a doctor. It was the strength of the bond between father and son. Michael knew that no matter what challenges they faced in the future, they would face them together. And with each other's support, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. As they sat there, watching the last light of day fade into the night, Michael knew that this experience had changed them both. It had made them stronger, more aware, and more compassionate. And in the end, that was the legacy they would carry with them forever.